Welcome back to the episode of Both Sides Now. Today we are very privileged to be in the office of Minister Chris Hipkins in the Beehive. So welcome, Minister, and thank you very much for giving us your time.
No worries. Happy to help.
So we start every episode with the basic question of what political ideology or philosophy do you identify with?
And it's a really difficult question to answer because if you're someone like me, you pick and choose a little bit from a number of different political ideologies. I think the idea that someone has to subscribe to a particular set of views and values and only those views and values, I think doesn't really reflect modern life or the way we live or the way actually democracy should function. So, if you think about, ideologies that I identify with larger parts of, I'm a liberal. So, liberalism is an ideology which I draw quite a lot from. But liberalism, you'll find in New Zealand politics, you'll find people with a liberal bent on the left and the right of the political spectrum. So I also, probably sit more on if you have a socialist capitalist spectrum, I'd sit more on the socialist side than the capitalist side. Having said that, there are elements of capitalism that I also subscribe to. So I'm a bit of a mixed bag, really.
Is the left better than the right, do you think? You've obviously voted for Labour for a long time. Should we always have a Labour government or do we need that 50-50 balance?
So I don't necessarily believe in just a left-right spectrum anymore. And I don't think that actually that's the way New Zealand politics exists now. So if you look at the Labour Party, for example, you'll find some people who are quite morally conservative, but very sort of pro-government intervention. Then on the National Party side, you'll find people who are very morally conservative but have a more pro-government bent in some areas. So the idea that there's this left-right divide, I think, isn't always accurate. There are different sets of values that underpin the thinking behind parties. You'll find people in Labour who tend to lean more towards a more interventionist, a more active government stance. But you'll find a few people who have some of those tendencies on the other side as well. And Labour probably has a disproportionately larger group of people who sit at the liberal kind of side of the political spectrum, whereas you'll find in National there's more conservatism. You can't generalise people on either side, though. There are people in National who I enjoy the company of and who I quite happily work well with, and whose company I may well enjoy more than some of the people on my own side. And vice versa, I'm sure. The reality is, I think New Zealand has thus far avoided the degree of polarisation that we've seen in other countries, and that's something that's great, but we can't take that for granted.
The definition of government that I personally sort of subscribe to is that the role of the state is to provide public goods and to account for externalities. Is that something you agree with?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are some things that only governments can really do. And, I mentioned before that, there are parts of capitalism I believe in. I do believe in markets, but I also believe that where market failure exists, there's a role for governments to intervene. And a good example of that we're dealing with right now in New Zealand is in the food and grocery sector. So, we've got monopolistic behaviour occurring within a natural market. The provision of consumer goods, that is something that markets should take the lead on. But where they're failing, and clearly they're failing at the moment, governments should step in.
Part of that definition for me, though, implies that we should be revenue raising based off externalities and using that to fund the public goods for New Zealand. At the moment, we only sort of revenue raise a bit off alcohol and cigarettes, things like nitrate tax, sugar tax, plastic taxes, carbon taxes. Should we be looking at those more generally for revenue raising? Currently, they're sort of mostly just used to then invest back into those problems.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule them out, but I haven't looked at that in huge detail, but you'll find most of them have unintended consequences associated with them as well. I remember there was a debate about sugar tax, which I did take some interest in a few years back. And on the surface of it, it might look attractive, but actually when you get into the detail of it, it starts to get quite difficult.
I want to go back to when you were talking before about the differences in National and Labour. It's kind of sort of thought that National is more for economic policies and Labour for social policies. Do you think that Labour still has a strong economic policy bent to it as well?
Well, actually, I think perception and reality don't always match in politics. And if you look at the economic history of New Zealand, actually New Zealand's done very well under Labour governments. So economic growth, for example, has been very strong typically under Labour governments. Unemployment has been quite low. but perceptions don't always match up with that. So we have this strange situation where when a Labor government comes into office, for example, business confidence tends to decline, even if the conditions that business are operating in, looking at objectively on the economic measures, are getting better. They will still feel less confident just because there's a government in place that they're perhaps not quite, so they don't have such a natural affinity with. If you look at the overall rate of household income growth, that tends to be stronger under a Labor government than under a national government. And so, and the facts are there, they will bear that out. That's not to say that, there aren't periods where where it will be the other way around. But I think Labor does have a good economic story to tell, in the sense of if what is the goal of economic management, if it is to make people's lives and livelihoods better, I think we've actually been very successful in that.
So you noted that business confidence tends to fall. Is that purely just a perception thing, or do you think there's been a history or something, some things that Labor have done that have will cause business confidence to fall when Labor comes into government?
Well, look, I acknowledge that some of the policies that Labor governments tend to pursue, like better pay and conditions for people who work for business, don't always please the managers and the owners of those businesses. But if you look at it in a broader economic sense, they work. Because they give people more disposable income. They raise the standard of living for people. And as a result, businesses actually do better out of that. So, the more people are earning, the more disposable income they have to spend. That's a good thing for business.
And on this idea of the perception versus reality point, when New Zealanders vote, do you think we're voting based on policy, or we're voting more based on sort of like personality, who's the leader of the party at the time?
I think the reality of democracies and modern democracies is people do tend to vote more based on how they feel rather than based on what they think. And we have to acknowledge that. Voting is an emotional thing, and people will take their emotions into the ballot box with them when they vote. And so they'll often be voting based on, am I feeling good about my life and the way things are heading, or am I feeling bad about that? When you talk to people about their decisions around how they voted, one way or the other, they often can't put their finger on a particular policy or a particular issue. It's just a general vibe that they take into the polling booth with them. There are people who are tribal one way or the other. Regardless of what happens, they're going to go and they're going to vote the same box every time. And then there's a whole group of people in the middle who vote much more based on what's happening at the time and how they're feeling about it.
How many New Zealanders, or percentage-wise, do you reckon roughly would sit in that sort of centre swing sort of group?
It's hard. It's hard to tell, because amongst the more tribal people, you'll find that they switch a little bit between their tribes. So if you like, on the left side of politics, if we were going to do a left-right divide, there's people who will switch between Labor and the Greens, and there's people who switch between National and ACT. They're never going to cross the divide and go the other way, vote for a party that would form an alternative government. They're just looking for a different variation of the same. The people who sit in the middle are quite happy to have quite different governments. And it's hard to put a number on that. I don't think it's necessarily a majority, but it probably wouldn't be far off it.
One of the big criticisms of government today is the money being spent on consultancies, namely the big four. Both Eve and I have got reservations about the efficacy generally of those big consultancies. What would you say to critics?
It's one of the really difficult balances any government has to deal with, is the balance between being accountable for how you're spending public money and the desire to do things faster and more efficiently. Governments, democracies aren't the most efficient way of doing things, but they're the most democratic and they're the fairest way of doing things. And so, if you think about Parliament as a whole, for example, Parliament is an inherently inefficient place. If you want to make fast decisions, a Parliament is not the way to do it. But actually, it's the lifeblood of democracy. Disagreement and dissent are the lifeblood of democracy. Take that out of it, and you no longer live in a free country. And so, to come directly to the issue that you've raised, many of those consultants, many of those kind of big firms, the role that they're performing is one of accountability. So if we're spending millions of dollars of taxpayer money on a particular project, for example, those bigger firms will be doing quality assurance on the value of that spend, making sure that the plans that underpin it are well-founded and robust. And so sometimes I get frustrated because I think sometimes the capability to do some of the work that's contracted to them should sit within the public service. They shouldn't need to go out to private sector contractors to do what in some cases is core public sector business. On the other hand, that does need for independence and when it comes to accountability, that can also be quite important.
So good point you make on quality assurance. Christopher Luxon often says that the government needs to go through line by line every policy, do a cost benefit analysis, make sure New Zealand's getting the maximum utility from every policy. Is that something you agree with or think you're doing at the moment?
Well, that in itself is an expensive exercise. If I turn my mind back to the Clark government, we used to do these things called value for money reviews, where you would go through a particular policy area, you look at everything that was currently being spent, and you would say, is it delivering on the outcomes, and so on. Almost every value for money review came back and said, we could get better value for money if we spent more. And that is the reality. So in every area of government, you'll find that we could do a better job if we spent more money. In every area of government, where people are saying, look, we should spend less overall, every one of those people will still have an area where they think we should spend more. And that's the difficult balancing act of democracy, right? You're always going to have competing interests.
Yeah, I guess you always get more, but it might be diminishing marginal returns as you spend more, though. Do you think?
It depends. You could make a case either way in most instances. I think one of the hardest sells for a government is to spend money in areas where the return is quite a broad-based return. So it's not one that you can necessarily point money in, money out, or money out, money in, I should say. So if you take some of the broader economic development initiatives that successive governments have backed, hosting the Rugby World Cup, winning the America's Cup, the Lord of the Rings, those sorts of things, governments have actually put financial backing into those ventures. That money doesn't flow back directly to government, but actually it flows back indirectly to government because you end up with higher rates of employment. In terms of, say, the Lord of the Rings, huge boom for our creative industries. And that created jobs, and that resulted in money flowing back to government. So those sorts of initiatives, there's always debate about the screen sector, for example. I'm one of those people who thinks that we should have the screen sector support that we've got at the moment because of the jobs that it creates. But if you're looking at it purely from how much money does government spend versus how much do we earn, you'd look at that quite skeptically. But if you think about it in terms of the broader return to the country and therefore the broader return back to government, it's absolutely justifiable.
I want to go back to a point you made before about how Parliament takes quite a while to pass things through. Obviously, during COVID, there was quite a lot of legislation passed quite quickly. Did you have concerns about how fast a lot of that was being pushed through? Yeah,
so in terms of the general legislation, that sort of tended to follow a pretty conventional path. There were some aspects of it that got truncated just out of necessity for time, but we still had select committees meeting. We still had that kind of democratic accountability. The bits that went fast were the bits that were directly related to the COVID response, and I was ultimately responsible for a lot of that. And, it'd be fair to say that all of that made me uncomfortable. The scope of the powers that we were exercising during the height of the COVID response should make anyone uncomfortable. It's a fine line between getting a country through a crisis using those kind of powers and ending up on the road to something that's no longer a democracy. The implementation of war powers or emergency powers is something that dictators do on the road from a democracy to a dictatorship. And so, we worked really hard to make sure we were building democratic checks into that. We had to move fast. So if you think about a decision to impose a lockdown, for example, often we would get information, we were making a decision the same day to do that. So you have to be able to move fast, but that's a massive decision to make. And so there should be accountability. There should be a democratic check on that. And so we put in place retrospective provisions. So yes, we were making decisions, but there was retrospective scrutiny of those decisions, and it happened quickly. So any order that I signed under the COVID Response Act went straight to the Regulations Review Committee, who were able to scrutinise it and report back to Parliament. If the Parliament didn't then vote to uphold that, then the order lapsed. So it's a safeguard against that sort of dictatorial behaviour where someone says, well, I'm in charge now, I'm passing myself all these great powers and there'll be no accountability. We couldn't get accountability before the fact, but we could get accountability after the fact. And the other major accountability, I think, that's in the sort of safeguard that's built in is that those powers need to be periodically reviewed and renewed, and if they're not, then they disappear. So again, on the road to a dictatorship, you'd find that's not there. That once those emergency powers are in, they tend to stay there, and the world's history is littered with examples of that. Our COVID-19 response powers will disappear, and I think within the next year or two they will disappear, because I think they're justifiable when you're dealing with an emergency. As the further away from the emergency you get, the more critical we should all be of that. So one of the programs of work that I had towards the end of my time as Minister for COVID Response was looking at how we regularise things again. So not everything that we're doing there needs to continue to be done using an emergency response. It can actually be done using regular processes again, because it's not something that needs to be done overnight. We can go back to using the conventional legislative process, for example, and it might be shortened. So rather than 6 months, it might be 2 months. But we can now go to something that's more regularised. On
COVID, what was the toughest decision you had to make?
Well, that was tricky. If I look back on hindsight, if I kept in hindsight for a moment,
it's always a wonderful thing.
Probably the two most difficult decisions or sets of decisions were around any kind of lockdowns and vaccination. And vaccination was the beginning of the vaccination mandates were certainly the beginning of a new attitude to COVID response, which made the whole thing more challenging. And for good reason and bad reason, a lot of misinformation out there that was just so frustrating and so heartbreaking, in fact. But also, there is a philosophical stance that sits at one part of the political spectrum that has a validity to it, which is that there's a matter of individual rights. No one should have to be vaccinated. And I can respect that position, though I disagree with it, in the sense that I think we've got a broader responsibility to each other in a global pandemic to keep each other safe. And in some instances that trumped. But overall, I think it's still a valid perspective. And so those who had it from a purely kind of principle-based perspective, I could have some respect for that. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that were anti-vax were doing so off the base of a lot of misinformation, and that was pretty sad.
Did you see those vaccine mandates culminating in the Parliament protest?
It was one of the things that contributed to it, no doubt. I mean, it probably was the catalyst for them arriving here in the first place. But what we saw by the end of the protest was something quite different. And it was actually in itself a real tragedy. It was very, very sad, because there were a lot of people on the forecourt of Parliament at the end who were completely marginalised and disconnected from the rest of the society and the rest of the community that we live in. And there were a whole variety of complex things that sat underneath that. There were people there with drug and alcohol addiction. There were people there with mental health problems. There were people there who just felt no sense of connection with the communities that they were, in theory, part of. And I think we should all reflect on that, because I absolutely don't condone what happened at the end of that protest. And it wasn't by the end, it wasn't a protest, it was an occupation. The abuse that the police were subject to was just unacceptable. The damage that was done to a public, a place that we should all be proud of, our Parliament, was just unacceptable. And there was a minority of people who did that. But there were a lot of people there who were just confused and bewildered, and that's just sad.
Changing lanes slightly, capital gains tax is something I really strongly believe in. I'm working on Eve. Jim Bolger's with me. We chatted to him last week. Do you believe in it?
It's complicated because as soon as you say something as broad as capital gains tax, it captures a whole lot of things that I wouldn't necessarily want to capture. But it does open up a new debate, which I think there is some legitimacy to. We already have some forms of capital gains in New Zealand. So if you look at the Bright Line test, it was introduced by a national government. It's effectively a form of capital gains tax. Tax on interest is a capital gain. It's a tax on capital gain. So there are some now. There are things that we should never tax. So someone buys their family home, they build up some equity in it. I don't think that should be taxed. On the other hand, is there a case for saying that people who are sitting on millions and millions and millions of dollars of assets, who are able to structure their finances in a way that means they pay very little tax, is that fair? No, I don't think that's fair. And so we should be focused more on talking about the fairness of the tax system, absolutely.
Yeah, there was a Stuff report that said the top wealthiest 1% in New Zealand pay an effective marginal tax rate of 12% of their income, and the average Kiwi is around 17%. So I think there's, even if you don't agree with those statistics, there is some really wealthy people in New Zealand that are paying a lower tax rate as a percentage of their income than most of New Zealand. I mean, how do we combat that going forward if we do to some extent have a regressive tax system?
Yeah, look, and I think fairness in the tax system should be the starting point for the debate rather than a particular type of tax. So I think we should be saying, how do we ensure that those of us who are doing well pay our fair share, and that, if we can even alleviate some of the tax burden from those who are just struggling to make ends meet on a day-by-day basis, then I'm open for that debate as well. So fairness in the tax system should absolutely be the guiding principle.
Changing lanes again slightly to one of your portfolios, education. So obviously you guys at the moment are looking at or working the process of centralising the polytech system, and it seems to kind of be a bit of a theme at the moment in the Labour government of centralising health and centralising looking to third three waters. Why does the current Labour government think that Wellington can run things better than the local regions?
Look, I think the debate around centralisation is a really lazy one, and it's basically people aren't looking at the detail of what's actually being proposed. So if you look at vocational education, for example, the reforms are much more complex than simply just centralising everything. In fact, that's not what's happening. There will still be regional polytechs in all the places where there are regional polytechs now. The difference is we're bringing together two quite different parts of the vocational education system. So we've had a boom and bust cycle with our vocational ed system. We've had on-the-job training, so apprenticeships and traineeships, which do really well when the labour market's strong, which it is at the moment. And the polytechs, which do really well when the economy turns down and there's higher rates of unemployment, because that's when people tend to upskill. And so we've had this boom and bust cycle. In reality, we need those two systems to be operating hand in glove. We don't need them to be operating as competing systems, because that hasn't served us well. It's why we've got the skill shortages that we've got now, among other things. So, we've got to tackle the fact that our population has grown so dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years that we haven't been able to keep up. And if we simply rely on dealing with the skill shortages we have by continuing to grow the population at that exponential rate that we have been, then actually we're never going to get on top of that problem. We've got to do a better job of skills training in New Zealand so that we're upskilling the population we've got now. Bringing the system together in a consolidated, streamlined way is the way to do that. That doesn't mean it's going to be centralised. It doesn't mean it's going to be all in Wellington. In fact, there'll probably be even, no more of it in Wellington now, that, in the future than there is now. It's still going to be spread all around the country. But can we get efficiencies? Can we get benefits by having it operating as a system as opposed to, a whole lot of competing parts that don't really interact properly with one another? Yes, I think we can. So, take HR, finance, the polytechs themselves, if you put them all together, they're only a bit bigger than the University of Auckland, in terms of the size and the turnover that they've got. They're not big organisations. And so they struggle with the economies of scale. They don't get the economies of scale that, say, the University of Auckland does. They don't have to be a centralised bureaucracy to get those economies of scale, though. They can be working together as part of a network to do that. So that's what the reforms are about. It's not centralisation. And I think people who characterise it that way are, I think, just misrepresenting it.
So SIT down south has traditionally done really well. Why, for example, you're looking at kind of messing with what's going on down there? Because that's kind of been a big criticism, I think, that they're saying, well, we're doing quite well, so stay away from us.
Yeah, I mean, SIT has done well, and sometimes they've done well because others haven't been doing so well. And so I think the idea that you could just say, carve off there were only two polytechs that were, when we started this, comfortably kind of in surplus. And even then, they wouldn't be now, even if we hadn't embarked on reform. So SIT and Otago Polytech. So the idea that you could just carve them off and say, okay, we'll fix the rest of the system, and that'll have no flow-on consequence for those two that were previously doing well, it simply wouldn't be true. So take Otago Polytech, for example. They had thousands of international students in Auckland that were cross-subsidising what they were doing in Dunedin. So you fix the rest of the country, you fix what's happening around the rest of the country. Would that still be a sustainable model at that point? And I don't think it would be. SIT did really well at attracting international students to Invercargill. That's great. And we want to see more international students going into our provincial areas. Would they still be as successful at doing that once the rest of the system has gotten better at it? There's a real risk that they wouldn't be. And so I think, do we still want international students at SIT campus in Invercargill and at the Dunedin campus in Otago? Yes, we do. And are we going to do a better job of that if they're marketing a national proposition, so a national brand? Yes, I think that we will. We went up to NAFSA, which is the biggest international education conference in the world. It was held in Denver back in May. And Te Pukenga launched its international strategy there. There was huge international interest in that because we will have one of the most powerful vocational education brands in the world in terms of being an international proposition. Even the people who were there who had previously worked for the 16 individual polytechs were saying, this is amazing. We're opening up opportunities that we would never have if we were 16 small polytechs. But as a national institution, man, we've got opportunities internationally that we didn't before. And regions can do really well out of that. And that includes places like Invercargill and Dunedin.
Do you foresee the government doing the same thing with universities, centralising universities?
I think the universities can cooperate more. The universities are a much larger sector. The polytech sector is actually quite a small sector, overall. It needs to be bigger, and I'm confident that we can grow it. The universities, other than if you take maybe Lincoln, who are a bit of an outlier, a very small institution, the rest of them, they are institutions that in and of themselves have scale. And it's a different market, different set of pressures. Actually, they're doing well. All of them, even Lincoln, who had some bumps in the road, they've managed to come right, and I hope they'll be able to sustain that. And the universities, there's not the burning platform there that there was with the vocational sector.
You've had a lot of different, lot of different profiles and change profiles, but is it not more efficient to have, as a minister, to have one profile you stick to through your tenure?
Well, I've been Minister of Education right the way through the tenure, and I've really enjoyed doing that. And one of the reasons that I've wanted to stay with that is I've wanted to see things through. So, after the election, I could have headed down the health route because just before the election, I was temporarily doing both. But I wanted to stick with education because I wanted to see that through. There are other areas where I think it is okay for people to sort of cycle in and out of. If you look at the COVID response, I had a particular brief, a particular role at that point in the COVID response cycle. We're in a different point in that now. It's now primarily a health issue. It's now primarily a health-led response. We don't have the lockdowns. We don't have all of those other restrictions that we were dealing with. It was much more of a whole of government response during that period that I was leading it. It's now a primarily health-driven response. And we've got someone who's got far more expertise in that health area than I have. So she is far more, Dr. Verrill's far more appropriate to lead that now in the point that the response is at than I would have been. So I think you do what you need to do. Yeah. You
were in your late 20s when you entered politics. Career politicians are often criticised for not having as much life experience. It's a common criticism from the right that, you haven't built a business, haven't worked in the real world. Is that something that has any validity for you, do you think?
Well, if you look at two of the most senior people in the National Party at the moment, they followed a very similar, career profile to my own. So, Nicola Willis, the Deputy Leader of the National Party, and their Finance Spokesperson, Chris Bishop, they have primarily, in their working lives, worked in the political sphere. They've had little brief sojourns into the private sector, as I have. That doesn't necessarily make us less qualified to be here. In fact, I think a good government has a balance. I think you need to have people who know how politics and government work, and then I think you need people who bring an outside perspective. But I've watched people come from very senior roles outside of politics into the democratic system and gotten completely lost and disillusioned and left on both sides of the house. And so you've got to have people who can actually run a government alongside people who bring that really valuable external perspective.
Do you think Labor's got the balance right between sort of academics and political people and MPs and real world people, for want of a better phrase?
I think if you judge it based on results, yes, absolutely. If you think about the broader economic perspective, which is where Labor governments have been criticised, and you look at the actual outcomes that Labor governments have achieved, it's right up there. In many cases, the outcomes have been better than outcomes achieved by national governments.
We've got record high inflation. Is that a good outcome?
Oh, no, it's a terrible outcome. And actually, there was very high inflation during the global financial crisis as well, not as high as it is now. But during the GFC, as with now, a lot of that was driven by international factors, as it is driven now by international factors. There is a major war being waged in another part of the world that New Zealanders are relatively isolated from and we don't really see, but it's having a huge effect on the global economy. And the global supply chain disruption that COVID-19 has caused is something that all leaders, when they get together, on an international forum, are really struggling with and really grappling with. You've got container ships just literally stacked up, waiting for berth in key congestion points around the world. If you talk to the ports here in New Zealand, they'll tell you that it's taking longer to load and unload ships than it normally would, because when they arrive in New Zealand, the ships are so poorly loaded because of the supply chain issues that are happening around the rest of the world. All of those things flow through into the prices that we pay for everything that we buy. But I think there are some things domestically that we can do more about. And, if you take the supermarket sector, for example, people are struggling to pay for their groceries, and yet the supermarkets are making mega profits, unjustified profits. The Commerce Commission has gone in and said they are making, they're making a regular profit, and then they're making profits over and above what would be a regular profit. That's not justifiable at this point. So I think there's more we can do in that area. Do
you think there are decisions that your government have made that have kind of contributed to inflation? Obviously, except there's a lot going on globally. Do you think there are decisions that you guys maybe didn't get right that have led to or contributed?
Well, if you look at the criticisms of the Reserve Bank, those criticisms are being made of reserve banks around the globe. Monetary policy is very, very fraught and very difficult in the types of economic conditions that we've seen. And everyone can look backwards and say, what they might have done differently. In reality, the behaviour of New Zealand's Reserve Bank was not different to the behaviour of reserves around the world. In fact, they were very much in line with the international trends. And if you look at New Zealand's inflation rate, we're actually sitting below the OECD average. So, it's not like we're an outlier here. In fact, we've got one of the lower inflation rates. It's still too high. It's still hurting. You understand why people feel that. But actually, UK, US, their inflation rates are higher. Australia is a little bit behind us in the inflationary cycle, but their inflation rate is climbing. It's, they haven't peaked out yet.
Would New Zealand be better off if we didn't have the ACT Party in Parliament?
No, I think New Zealand would be better off. The more diverse the views in Parliament, the better. And so, no, I think ACT is important. I think the Greens are important. I think the Māori Party is important. I do think that there is a group of New Zealand who identify with some of the more nationalistic policies that were promoted by parties such as New Zealand First, for example, who probably at the moment aren't feeling particularly represented by the parties that are in Parliament at the moment. And that's a risk for democracy, because when people are feeling heard and they're feeling represented, even if they're not getting what they want, that tends to lead to a stronger democracy. Where democracy becomes threatened is where people feel that they are marginalised and excluded from the democratic process. So I think the broader the range of perspectives on offer in Parliament, the healthier. Of course, I hope that there'll be minority perspectives, but they should still be represented.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's something Eve and I both agree with. In the US, they debate to find a party leader rather than a voting system like we've got here. Is that something we should look at? And have you got any leadership aspirations?
No, look, I came into Parliament passionate about education. And that has been the driver for me. Now, I won't be Minister of Education forever. I acknowledge that. I'm loving the job. It is the job that I'm passionate about. Having said that, there are other things that I have become passionate about. I never would have imagined that I would have helped to lead the country through the COVID-19 response. I got involved in that. I enjoyed it. It was an enormous challenge, and I was very happy to hand it on to someone else. Being Minister of Police, I did a degree in criminology almost by accident, because I did an undergraduate paper to fill in a gap in my timetable, as you sometimes do, and just found it fascinating and really got into it. And so being Minister of Police is a portfolio that I'm quickly becoming just as passionate about as well. I'm here to make a difference rather than necessarily to focus on the jobs that I have. So you take the opportunities that are in front of you. As an opposition member of Parliament, I still tried to find a way to make a contribution, even though we weren't in government. Ultimately, one of my school teachers used to have a sign above the whiteboard saying leadership is about action and opposition. And I totally agree with that.
You mentioned you're Minister of Police. Do you reckon we've got a crime problem in New Zealand at the moment?
if you look at the overall crime statistics, so there's two types of crime statistics. So there's victimization, which is based on an objective survey of people, as to whether they've been the victims of crime or not. And then there's police statistics, so there's recorded crime. Some areas of recorded crime are going up, and that actually is a positive thing because the overall level of victimization in those areas is not. So what it shows is, if you look at family violence, for example, the overall level of victimization from family violence isn't increasing, but the amount of it's being reported to police is. That's a good thing. That's something that we should absolutely encourage. It means that those messages that successive governments have said for the last 20 years, that it's not okay, it means that it's getting through and it's changing societal attitudes. Tough gig for the police, though, because they've got to respond to that far more than they used to. Domestic and family violence used to be something that got swept under the carpet. Now police are expected to be involved. That's a good thing, but it puts more pressure on police. There are areas where we're seeing a bit of a spike at the moment. So in violent crime and gang-related criminal offending, we are seeing a spike there. That tends to be much more gang on gang than gang on, members of the public. But it is something people should be concerned about. It's something that I'm concerned about.
So I guess the million-dollar question is, how are we going to fix all the gangs that are happening, gang crime happening at the moment? And obviously there are a lot of ram raids going on of shops. Yeah,
I think we've got to look at this from both ends. So we've got to absolutely tackle the activities that gangs are involved in. Those gang convoys are intimidating. It's unfair on other members of the public. We should absolutely have stuff that's focused on that end of the criminal offending from gangs. But then we've got to go right back to the causes. Where do the gangs make their money? They make a lot of money off drugs. How do we stop people getting hooked on drugs in the first place? How do we stop young, vulnerable people ending up on this pathway that leads them into gangs? Many of those young, vulnerable people find a sense of belonging in a gang that they haven't been able to find somewhere else. So let's find something else for them. Let's make sure they find that sense of belonging somewhere else. Then they won't end up on that criminal offending pathway. So I think we've got to do it at both ends. It's not going to be an overnight fix, though. Anyone who's saying, we can just pass this law and it'll all change overnight, they're wrong. It's not going to happen that way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that it kind of needs both ends to fix it. On the comment on drugs, do you reckon that drugs should be decriminalised across all areas, make it a health problem?
Look, in things like methamphetamine and so on, no, absolutely not. The harm there is massive. But we can do more to reduce the demand. Drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs, the drug part of it in particular, but actually alcohol as well. Alcohol is also causing huge harm within society for people who are hooked on it. We do need to do more in that area. The relationship between criminal offending and drug use is absolutely established. Police have recently done an analysis that shows that they took two groups of offenders, those who were convicted but were not drug dependent and those who were drug dependent. The level of crime-related harm from those who were hooked on drugs was about 7 times as high as the level of crime-related harm from a similar cohort of offenders who weren't. So let's deal with the drugs, absolutely. But I'm not convinced that decriminalisation or legalisation is the route. In terms of cannabis, the New Zealand public have their say on that, and I respect that.
Cool. To finish things off, what's the biggest challenge New Zealand's facing right now?
Right now, it's the cost of living, but long term, it's not going to be that. The cost of living issues go in peaks and troughs. I was here during the last peak of cost of living concerns during the global financial crisis. That comes and goes. We will find our way through that. We will sort that. Long term, though, what's the big challenge? How's New Zealand going to make a living in the future? There are huge, mega challenges confronting the world, confronting humanity, that we've got to get more involved in. Artificial intelligence is here. It's going to play a bigger role in our day-to-day lives. That brings huge moral and ethical dilemmas. We're not grappling with that. So, people were talking about autonomous vehicles, for example. Okay, that's fine. Let's say we have the technology that can mean that our vehicles are autonomous. Who's programming them? Who's making the moral and ethical judgments behind how they actually operate? Think about it this way. You've got two cars heading towards each other and a child steps onto the road. And the only way that the car that the child's in front of can avoid hitting the child is to hit the other car. That has to be predetermined. Someone's got to program it to decide what to do in those circumstances. So there's all of this moral and ethical stuff around artificial intelligence. We're not really talking about that. The algorithms that feed social media platforms, influencing our day-to-day lives far, far more than we ever would have imagined. 1984 was wrong. Big Brother is here, but it's not the government. Facebook knows far more. If we took everything that we as a government know about each individual citizen, it's a fraction of what Facebook knows about you. You know, Big Brother is here, but it's not the government. So I think those big challenges, those massive challenges, are ones that are in front of us. So the immediate ones: cost of living, environmental sustainability, which of course links to the longer term challenge. Those are things that we've got to grapple with the here and now, but we've also got to get a greater sense of urgency about some of those longer term challenges.
Awesome.
Kia ora, Chris. Thanks very much for your time.
Yeah.
Fees-free first-year university.
Yes.
Should police permanently carry handguns?
No.
Should the minimum wage be a living wage?
Yes.
Should all prisoners have the right to vote?
Yes.
Should the threshold for MMP be lowered below 5%?
Yes.
What person, living or dead, would you most want to have dinner with?
Or Obama.
Should Parliament have diversity quotas?
No.
Is climate change New Zealand's nuclear free movement?
Yes.
Should the world have nuclear weapons?
In an ideal world, no.
Is New Zealand underpopulated?
No.
House prices up, down, or stay the same?
Stay the same.
Should New Zealand become a republic?
Yes.
Should New Zealand protect 30% of our marine environment to align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes.
Are your friends equally from the left and right?
Probably not.
Tax on plastic pollution?
Possibly.
Who is someone from the opposite side of the political spectrum you most admire?
There are people who I get on well with. Nikki Kay, I worked very well with and really respect her. There are people over there. Todd Muller is someone who I got on very well with and have admired his stance on some issues.
Fees-free, compulsory te reo in schools?
Universal te reo in schools eventually, yeah.
And should the threshold for MMP be lowered below 5%? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks very much for your time.
No worries.
Thank you.